Okay, let's jump right in. Today, we are taking a deep dive into some challenging and, well, incredibly relevant ideas.
We are. We're looking at Erich Fromm's big work, known either as The Fear of Freedom or Escape from Freedom, depending on where you are.
And Fromm, he really hits us with a core question, doesn't he? What does this whole concept of freedom actually feel like to
Oh.
us as individuals?
Yeah, and why does he argue it can often become, well, less something we strive for and more like a burden, something people actually try to escape from?
Exactly. So our mission here really is to unpack Fromm's main argument using the material we have. We want to explore that whole psychological journey of gaining freedom.
And the deep insecurity it can, maybe paradoxically, bring with it.
Right. And the ways people maybe unconsciously try to get away from that anxiety that comes up.
And Fromm lays out this fundamental tension right from the get-go. He says, look, as humanity over centuries broke free from those really strong external ties, the kind you saw in medieval society.
Like being tied to your social role, the land.
Exactly. As we gained freedom from that, we simultaneously started feeling more isolated and counterintuitively actually more insecure.
It really makes you think. Is there like a tipping point? Can freedom become just too much? And why do some people champion liberty so fiercely while others seem almost drawn to submission, to authority figures?
Or even just melting into the crowd,
Yeah.
conforming. Is there a psychological reason for that? Fromm? Think so?
And his whole perspective, which is pretty crucial to get, is that you can't understand the big social and political movements without digging into individual psychology.
Our desires, our fears, our passions, even our reason.
And this is key, right? He doesn't see that psychology as fixed. He argues it's constantly shaped by the socioeconomic world we're living in.
It's an interplay, always back and forth. Psychology shapes society, society shapes psychology.
Okay, so that interplay. It brings us right to where Fromm starts what he calls the fundamental human situation.
He uses the Garden of Eden myth as a kind of analogy. Humanity emerges from just pure instinct, being part of nature.
And we gain choice, conscious thought. We see ourselves as separate, as individuals.
And that, he says, that's the first real act of freedom. Separating from nature, from automatic belonging.
But there's an immediate consequence, a big one.
Oh yeah, breaking free from those instinctual bonds, it shatters that original harmony, that effortless sense of belonging.
Suddenly we're individuals, which sounds good.
But we're also alone, vulnerable, maybe even ashamed, like the myth says, naked and ashamed.
So, okay, beyond needing food and water, Fromm says this other huge human need pops up.
A really profound one, the need to connect, to be related to the world outside ourselves, to somehow overcome that aloneness.
And he's very specific, isn't he? It's not just being physically alone that's unbearable.
No, it's what he calls moral aloneness, that feeling of not being connected to shared ideas or values, or even just a social structure you understand. He quotes Balzac saying it's this utter horror. It really sticks with you.
Yeah, it does. And this connects to his idea of primary ties, right, in those earlier societies.
Exactly. Like the Middle Ages. Think family, clan, the whole rigid social and religious community structure. They provided security, unquestioned security.
You knew your place.
You absolutely knew your place. It was fixed. You belonged. You were rooted in this structured whole. Even if life was tough, you weren't adrift.
But history doesn't stand still. Fromm sees this process, this dialectic.
Right. As the individual starts to emerge from those primary ties, he calls it individuation.
Yeah.
They gain independence, sure.
More freedom from.
More freedom from. But the flip side is this growing aloneness, this feeling of being small and powerless compared to this huge, complex world out there.
And that growing aloneness, that's where the anxiety comes in, the deep anxiety he keeps coming back to.
Let's really contrast that medieval world with what followed. In medieval times, individual freedom, well, not as we think of it, it barely existed.
You were pretty much stuck in your social role, right? Couldn't just pick up and move or change jobs easily.
Very limited mobility, yeah. And your sense of self was all tied up in that role.
Yeah.
You were a peasant or a knight or a priest, not primarily John Smith, unique individual.
There's a kind of security in that, I guess, not having to figure it all out yourself.
That's from Tom's point. But then things change. Late Middle Ages, early modern era, huge shifts.
The old medieval unity starts cracking.
Yeah, capital starts moving differently. Individual economic initiative becomes a thing. Competition heats up. You get this new moneyed class emerging.
And the old feudal structures are crumbling. Cities grow, but lots of people in them are being exploited.
And the psychological impact of all this, massive. People lost that old security blanket, the social structure. the church's absolute
So
authority.
this new freedom, it was double-edged.
Totally. For some, it meant new strength, new opportunities. They could, grab them. But for many others, it just meant way more isolation, doubt, skepticism, and this gnawing anxiety.
That feeling of being insignificant.
Yeah.
Powerless against these big, impersonal economic forces.
Exactly that. And the whole ethic around money and work changed drastically. Tawney points this out. The medieval view mostly saw economics as serving salvation, serving moral ends.
Making money wasn't the main goal. Greed was bad.
Right. But then capitalism rises, and boom, individual enterprise, accumulating wealth for its own sake, that becomes the driving force. From the quotes this guy Butzer, lamenting how everyone's just chasing the most profitable trade, ignoring everything else, and it's all saturated with dishonesty.
And the market itself changes too, right? It's not just your local village market anymore.
No, it becomes huge, anonymous, unpredictable. You're producing for this vast potential demand you can't even really gauge.
Which ramps up the competition.
Massively. That replaces the older ideas of cooperation or guild regulations. It really turns into swimmer's sink. Constant pressure.
Okay, so you've got this backdrop. Near freedom, but also terrifying near anxiety and instability.
And it's right into this environment that Fromm sees the Reformation bursting forth. Protestantism, Calvinism.
He sees them as expressing this new feeling of freedom, breaking from the Catholic Church's authority.
Yes, that's the freedom from part. But he also argues they provided a kind of psychological escape from the sheer burden of that new freedom.
That's a really interesting angle. So how did the doctrines themselves play into that psychologically? Luther and Calvin especially.
Well, think about their critique of things like Catholic indulgences. That implied you could do something, earn your salvation through works. You had some agency.
Okay.
Luther flips that. He emphasizes man's complete powerlessness, inherent sinfulness. You're worthless without God's grace. The only way is absolute submission to God's overwhelming power.
Salvation isn't earned, it's just given through faith.
Given through faith. And Fromm zeroes in on this. Faith becomes this undoubtable subjective experience. It's a way for the individual feeling lost and full of doubt, and Luther himself apparently felt intense doubt, to find some kind of inner certainty amidst the external chaos.
So psychologically, Fromm reads that faith as a defense mechanism, a reaction against the isolation and doubt.
Sort of, yeah. A reaction formation. It allows you to accept your own feeling of insignificance and, crucially, prepares you psychologically to subordinate your entire life to something huge and external.
Not just God, but maybe other things too.
Potentially. Like relentless work, economic productivity, accumulating capital. Even though Luther himself wasn't pro-capitalist in his views, Fromm thinks his doctrine of man's nothingness, sort of, pays the psychological runway for accepting a life where you become a tool for economic ends.
Wow. And Calvin, predestination seems even harsher.
It does, on the surface. Man is just a tool for God's glory. Your actions don't determine salvation. It's already decided. So It's like it would just crank up the anxiety, right? How could you ever know?
Yeah.
But Fromm's psychological reading is different. He suggests it actually silenced the doubt by taking individual effort completely out of the salvation picture. It's decided. Nothing you do matters for that. It also, he notes, kind of shattered human solidarity by dividing everyone into the chosen and the damned. No middle ground.
And the famous Calvinist work ethic.
Right. Fromm emphasizes the intense, unceasing effort wasn't supposed to earn you salvation. It was more like a compulsory sign, maybe. Or just a duty born out of that underlying anxiety and powerlessness.
He calls it frantic activity.
Yeah, like you're desperately trying to convince yourself or maybe just run away from the uncertainty. It's not coming from a place of inner strength or confidence. And this focus on work for its own sake, accumulation as a duty, that's a massive psychological shift from the Middle Ages.
Okay, so this psychological groundwork laid during the Reformation, Fromm sees modern industrial capitalism basically picking up those threads and running with them.
Intensifying them, yeah. Capitalism keeps developing the individuals. We become more independent, more critical in some ways, but it also makes us feel more helpless. Freedom might increase on paper, but new complex dependencies crop up. We might be freer from, say, strict religious dogma, but we feel more alone, more afraid in other ways.
And this leads to that idea you mentioned, the gap between quantitative and qualitative freedom.
Exactly. We fight tooth and nail for our external freedoms, political rights, free speech, all that. And we should. But Fromm asks, do we have the inner capacity to actually use that freedom? Do we have the inner conviction, the spontaneous energy, the real developed individuality to make those freedoms more than just the absence of chains? Can we actually be free inside?
That feeling of being insignificant, powerless, he sees that everywhere in modern society.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Look at the economy. Giant corporations, monopolies. How much confidence can the small business owner, the independent craftsperson, really have in just their own initiative anymore?
You feel like a cog.
You feel like a cog. Whether you're in a white-collar office job or working on an assembly line, you're part of this huge impersonal machine you don't control.
Even as a customer, right? You mentioned that department store example.
Yeah. The store cares about the customer as a statistic, a demographic, but you're anonymous, replaceable. Nobody's personally thrilled you walked in. You're just a unit.
And politically, too. Feeling overwhelmed by the sheer size of parties, the constant spin and propaganda.
Totally. It makes the individual feel tiny. And Fromm points out how propaganda often plays on irrational fears, bypassing critical thought, even while it flatters you by saying, "We trust your judgment."
It creates that weird mix. He talks about cynicism about everything, but also being weirdly naive about authority.
Exactly, that strange combination. Plus, the everyday anxieties, fear of unemployment, dreading old age in a society that prizes youth and productivity above all. It takes a toll.
He even brought up Mickey Mouse as a symptom.
Yeah, back then. He saw people identifying with this small, persecuted character, always up against overwhelming power, only finding relief through luck or escape, never through inner strength. It reflected a feeling of helplessness.
So, to sum up Fromm's picture of modern psychology, it's marked by aloneness, isolation, feeling like an instrument, feeling bewildered and insecure.
Right, and he distinguishes between things that just compensate for that insecurity, like maybe having property or strong national pride.
Things that make you feel better temporarily.
Kind of. Versus things that actually strengthen the self, like real freedom of thought, actual initiative, genuine rational understanding of the world. Those compensations don't build inner strength, he argues.
Okay, so if that's the psychological landscape, isolation, anxiety, powerlessness, it leads directly to the title, right? The escape from freedom.
Exactly. These are the mechanisms people use, often unconsciously, to try and get rid of that burdensome, isolated self, to escape the terror of being alone and powerless.
And he's clear, these aren't healthy solutions.
Not at all. They might feel like a solution to an unbearable state, but Fromm compares them to neurotic symptoms. They ultimately damage the self. They don't lead to real happiness or growth.
So the first big mechanism he discusses is authoritarianism.
Right, and he sees two sides to this coin, deeply linked. Masochistic tendencies and sadistic tendencies.
Let's break that down. Masochism first. What does that look like?
It's the drive to give up your own independence, to try and fuse yourself with something or some outside you that feels bigger, stronger, more powerful.
How does that manifest?
Feelings of inferiority, weakness, constant self-criticism, a deep need to depend on others, maybe a leader, an institution, an ideology, God, whatever. It's about dissolving your scary, isolated self into a larger whole to feel safe. Escaping insignificance by becoming part of something significant.
Okay, and the sadistic side, the flip side of that coin.
That's the drive to dominate others, the lust for power over people, making them dependent on you, exploiting them, controlling them, even causing them pain, physically or mentally.
And the crucial point Fromm makes is that these aren't really opposites.
Not psychologically. He argues they spring from the exact same root. The inability to stand being alone, the inability to tolerate the weakness and isolation of the individual self.
So both are trying to achieve, what did he call it? Symbiosis.
Yes, symbiosis. A kind of unhealthy fusion where neither person keeps their own integrity. One person loses themselves by being, metaphorically, swallowed up by the other.
And the other gains a sense of strength by doing the swallowing.
Exactly. Both are driven by that desperate need to escape aloneness, by merging, by losing their separate selves.
And these drives, they can be hidden, right? Rationalized.
Oh, absolutely. Conscious, unconscious, dressed up as love or duty or necessity. He talks about loving sadism, controlling someone completely but framing it as intense care. That Balzac example of the abbé basically consuming Lucien's life fits here. It's possession disguised as devotion.
And this is totally different from rational authority, like trusting an expert because they know their stuff.
Totally different. Rational authority is based on competence, shared goals. This authoritarianism is based on that deep psychological need to fuse, to control, or be controlled. And he also mentions the magic helper idea, depending on someone else to fix your life, making them the center instead of yourself, which ironically can breed resentment towards the helper.
Okay, so authoritarianism is one escape. What's the second?
Destructiveness. And he's careful here. This isn't just normal anger when you're attacked.
It's more like a personality trait, a constant tendency.
Yeah, a kind of constantly lingering drive towards destroying things, people, the world, even the self sometimes.
And where does that come from?
Partly, maybe, trying to eliminate things that make you feel small or envious. But Fromm digs deeper. He links it again to that profound isolation and powerlessness, the anxiety, but especially to what he calls the thwarting of life.
The thwarting of life, what does that mean?
Basically, when your natural potential for growth, for creativity, for spontaneous living is blocked or frustrated, that energy has to go somewhere.
That's the core idea. The more your innate drive towards life and growth is stifled, the stronger the counter drive towards destruction becomes. It's like curdled life energy turning toxic.
Wow. Okay, and the third major escape mechanism, automaton conformity. And Fromm thinks this one is maybe the most common, the most insidious in modern democratic societies.
Automaton conformity, so becoming like a robot.
Kind of. The individual basically stops being themselves. They adopt wholesaling, the personality, the thoughts, the feelings, the desires that are offered up by the culture, by the expectations around them.
They become just like everyone else.
Exactly like everyone else, doing and saying and feeling what's expected. And the benefit, it makes that terrifying gap between the lonely I and the big, scary world seem to disappear. The conscious fear of being alone fades because you're no longer different.
Like camouflage. Blend in, disappear.
Perfect analogy, protective coloring. But the really challenging part is Fromm's claim that most people doing this genuinely believe they're still individuals. They think their thoughts are their thoughts, their feelings are their feelings.
But he says it's often an illusion.
A dangerous illusion, yeah. Because if you don't realize you're conforming, you can't address the underlying anxiety driving it. He uses that hypnotism example. Someone can be totally convinced they're acting freely while just following suggestions.
So this leads to things like pseudo-thinking.
Right. You hear an opinion, maybe on the news or from someone you respect, you adopt it, and then you genuinely feel like it's your reasoned conclusion. You might even argue for it passionately.
But it didn't actually originate with you, through your own experience or critical thought.
Exactly. It's not necessarily illogical, it just lacks authenticity. It's borrowed. The same goes for pseudo-feelings, feeling happy at a party because you're supposed to, even if you're miserable inside, or pseudo-willing, pursuing a goal like a career because it's expected, not because you genuinely desire it.
Repression plays a role here, pushing down the real feelings and desires.
Definitely. You squash the parts of your real self that don't fit the mold, and the pseudo-self takes over.
The pseudo-self, it's like an actor who forgets they're acting.
That's a great way to put it. An agent playing a role, but believing they are the role, having lost touch with the original self who's supposed to be doing the thinking and feeling.
And modern society, Fromm argues, actually encourages this.
He thinks so. From early education, maybe subtly discouraging strong emotions like anger or deep sadness, making original thinking seem difficult or risky, we get fed ready-made thoughts through media.
That mix of skepticism about truth, but also being kind of naive towards authority figures.
Yeah, that contributes. Plus, the sheer flood of information, often disconnected, makes it hard to build your own coherent picture of the world, so people fall back on simplified, given narratives.
And the cycle repeats. Conforming makes you lose your real self, which makes you feel weaker and more insecure.
Which then increases the need to conform even more to feel safe. And this whole situation, feeling powerless but believing you're free, losing your real self, Fromm sees this as creating really fertile ground for authoritarian movements, like fascism.
Okay, so building right on that point, Fromm uses this whole psychological framework to analyze Nazism.
He does, and he's very clear. You can't just explain Nazism through economics or politics alone. To understand its powerful hold on people, you have to look at the psychological factors, the character structures that were receptive to it.
But he still connects those psychological factors back to the socioeconomic situation.
Always. That interplay is central. He argues that specific character traits were intensified by the specific pressures faced, particularly by the German lower middle class at that time.
Right. What was going on with them specifically, according to Fromm?
Before World War I, he says, this class had a strong sense of pride based on their social standing, respect for authority, the state, the family, tradition. They felt relatively secure.
But after the war?
Disaster, rapid economic decline, devastating hyperinflation that wiped out savings and destroyed faith in the state's authority, massive social frustration, a feeling of being cheated, left behind.
Which often got projected onto scapegoats.
Exactly. like the Jews who became targets for that displaced anger and frustration. And Fromm argues these intense pressures amplified existing tendencies within that class's character structure.
Tendencies like?
That sadomasochistic dynamic we talked about. A deep craving for submission to a powerful authority, combined with a frustrated desire for power and dominance over others perceived as weaker.
And Nazi ideology, Hitler's whole approach, directly tapped into this.
Directly and effectively. The appeal was overwhelmingly emotional, not rational. From points to Hitler's specific propaganda methods deliberately trying to break the audience's critical thinking, using exhaustion to make them more suggestible, constantly shifting his appeals to trigger different emotional needs.
Yeah, and Hitler's own personality.
Fromm analyzes it as clearly sadomasochistic. Adoration for the powerful, utter contempt for the weak. He notes Hitler was quite open about his lust for power, even while offering rationalizations. And his philosophy for the masses emphasized self-denial. They were supposedly too poor for happiness anyway, while reserving the right to power for himself and the elite.
So the ideology resonated with the character structure, and the system itself reinforced it.
Precisely. The Nazi hierarchy: submit to those above, dominate those below it. It gave people a structure where they could live out those sadomasochistic impulses. It provided a twisted kind of substitute security, replacing the lost stability of their old world order.
Okay, so we've journeyed through these escape mechanisms: authoritarianism, destructiveness, conformity. It's a pretty bleak picture of trying to shed the burden of freedom.
It is heavy stuff. But Fromm doesn't just leave us there. He does offer a way forward, a possibility he calls positive freedom.
So escaping from isn't enough.
Necessary, but not sufficient. That freedom from external chains, from those primary ties, it leads to isolation, if that's all you have.
Yeah.
And that isolation drives the escape back into new kinds of bondage.
So positive freedom is freedom to be something.
Exactly. Freedom to. It's the state where the individual exists as a truly independent, unique self, while also being genuinely connected to the world, connected to others, to nature.
Through what?
Through spontaneous activity. That's the absolute key for Fromm.
Spontaneity. What does he mean by that exactly? It's not just being random.
No, not at all. It's the genuine, unimpeded expression of your whole self, your emotional capacities, your senses, your intellect. It's about being authentically you.
Without the masks, without the pseudo-self.
Right. It means accepting your entire personality, the good and the bad, overcoming that split we often make between our rational side and our natural or emotional side.
He gives examples like artists or young children.
Yeah, people who often demonstrate that ability to feel, think, create from an inner place without being totally filtered by shoulds or external roles. That kind of genuine expression.
And the effect of this spontaneous activity.
It strengthens the self.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, Fromm has that line: the self is as strong as it is active. And he means active in this spontaneous, authentic way.
So strength isn't about possessing things or controlling people.
No. It's an inner strength that comes from genuine self-expression and engagement with the world.
He also sort of redefines things like ideals and sacrifice, doesn't he?
He does. Genuine ideals, for Fromm, are ones that promote life, growth, the realization of the self. Pathological goals, like the ones driving authoritarianism, are rooted in life-denying destructive impulses.
And real sacrifice, it's not about crushing yourself.
No, it's an affirmation. An affirmation of your own core values, maybe even for the sake of others, but it comes from a place of strength and connection, not self-negation or submission.
Now, from being Fromm, he connects this potential for positive freedom to society too, right? It's not just an individual psychological task.
Absolutely. He believed that achieving widespread positive freedom is deeply linked to creating a more rational economic and social system. Maybe something like democratic socialism. He suggests a system designed to actually serve human needs and development, rather than just capital accumulation.
So it requires political and economic change, overcoming hidden power structures.
Yes, challenging the dominance of purely economic motives. He thought it would need things like decentralization and real active cooperation from individuals to make sure any planning actually serves the people involved.
So the ultimate challenge then for a democracy isn't just protecting negative freedoms.
No. To really counter the kind of despair and nihilism that fuels escapes from freedom, Fromm argues democracy needs to actively cultivate and inspire faith.
Not blind faith, though.
No, not dogma. Faith in life itself. Faith in truth. And faith in freedom understood as this active, spontaneous realization of each individual self. That's the goal.
So, quite a journey through Fromm's ideas. We've really unpacked how gaining freedom historically brought this unexpected shadow of isolation.
Yeah, leading so many, he argues, to try and escape that burden into submission, sometimes destructiveness, or maybe most commonly, just blending in through conformity. Anything but stand alone.
And the central takeaway, really sticking with me, is that freedom from is only half the battle, maybe the easier half.
Possibly. The deeper, maybe lifelong challenge is achieving that positive freedom, that inner state of being active, spontaneous, connected, truly yourself.
Because without working towards that, we risk becoming those automatons he warned about, living under this illusion that we're individuals, while really just being pushed around by external forces or our own internalized fears.
A sobering thought.
It really is. And maybe, as you listen and go back into your day, building on Fromm's idea of the pseudo-self. Just take a moment now and then. Consider the thoughts you're thinking, the feelings bubbling up, the things you want. How often do you pause and genuinely ask, is this really mine? This thought, this feeling, this desire? Or is it something I've absorbed, something I think I'm supposed to think or feel or want?
That's the question, isn't it? What would it actually mean? Or maybe, what would it even take for you to truly know the difference?